A Spider's Web, Prologue. It was just a glimmer in Joe Morgan's eye, just the least smile and sideways glance. It made Gordon shiver. The dynamic duo were never beneath a little practical joke, but somewhere in Gordon Martin's 15-year-old brain, he wondered if Joe's jokes weren't sometimes dangerous, even scary dangerous. Don't be misled. Gordon loved to ride on the coattails of Joe's exploits, particularly because they very often involved their mutual friend Alice Wickens. Sometimes as partner, sometimes as audience. Joe was in love with Alice. Gordon was in love with Alice, but only Joe didn't notice the affection that the other felt. Alice Wickens, high school sophomore extraordinaire, was tall with long brown hair and brown eyes with lashes that seemed to never end, and she and Gordon were good friends. They met in 1963 when both turned 6 years old. That was the year that Gordon's now single mother, Doris, came to work for Helen, Alice's mom, as a housekeeper. Doris and her son lived alone in the same town as Helen. The name of the town was Dysonville, Tennessee. On school days, Helen loaned Doris her car so that Doris could pick up both Alice and Gordon. Pickup took place at 2 different schools and in 2 different directions. Doris didn't mind the drive. It was a break in her afternoon. 10 minutes to pick up Alice, another 25 to pick up Gordon, then back to Helen's house. Over the years, Alice and Gordon spent many afternoons together, and during the summer months, this arrangement also included full days for Gordon, Alice, and their very good friend Joe Morgan to pursue their adventures. This was the plan one muggy, late summer evening. Joe borrowed a female mannequin from the Woolworths where he worked with his uncle. Then, knowing that Alice and Helen wouldn't be home, Gordon and Joe drove the mannequin to Helen's house. Joe insisted that they drive. He simply couldn't see how it would work otherwise, so off they went, ignoring the limits of the learner's permanent regulations and placing Gordon in danger of giving himself whiplash in his panic to watch for the police in every direction at once. They arrived without incident. Helen and Alice were out to dinner together, a weekly event rarely postponed or canceled. Joe and Gordon removed the mannequin from the car and carefully, ever so carefully, positioned it just so in Helen's lily pond. The pond, although at some distance from the house, was clearly visible from the screened back porch where Helen sat every evening, weather permitting. Joe had planned. He knew they had time to sink the naked mannequin far enough into the water so it didn't look like a mannequin. Time to position the arm just right and to consider if the legs should show or not, and if so, how much. Time to stand back and observe. This is a work of art, Joe thought to himself. No ordinary practical joke. He enjoyed the familiar surge of fear and excitement. Gordon just thought he might throw up. In the end, they decided that the left arm should be on the side of the pond, the elbow resting on the stone edge with the head reclining on that same arm. Nothing else, with the exception of the neck and a bit of the top of the chest, would show. It was a grisly sight. It was perfect. Then they heard it. Car tires coming up the drive, voices arguing. Apparently dinner had not gone off as planned. Something about school starting up soon and needing some time alone. The dive into the bushes was Gordon's idea. Joe seemed to be frozen in space. Gordon pulled him into the camellia, breaking several of the old bush's limbs, and in the process, making enough noise to alert the sheriff in the next town. "What on earth?" Alice said, following the noises through the house, onto the porch and out to the pond. "Oh my God," she yelled at the boys, then burst into laughter. "Wow, are you ever in trouble? Is that a mannequin from the store?" It was just then that Joe's uncle's car showed up with Joe's dad in the driver's seat. He parked the car and stepped out. Then, within an eerie silence, he removed the mannequin and 2 terrified and disappointed young men from Helen's property. Chapter 1. Lorraine Hamilton arrived at church in a perfect tan suit with perfectly matching shoes, impeccable hair, and a smile that absolutely chilled the spring air. At 42, she remained strikingly beautiful. She felt a familiar pleasure as all eyes turned her way. She walked to her seat in a style somewhat resembling a bride and looked quietly around the room. She smiled as the choir sang. She smiled as the readings were read. She smiled at the pastor as he rose to speak, and alarmed at finding himself smiling back, he cleared his throat and began his sermon in a somewhat unnecessarily serious manner. When the service ended, Lorraine buzzed amongst the parishioners like a wasp on the lawn, expressing saccharine joy at seeing them again. All nodded and smiled back in general confusion. "Lorraine! Lorraine!" Polly Franklin was racing across the yard, waving wildly. "Lorraine, how are you?" she said somewhat loudly, and in a hissing whisper continued, "What are you doing here? Has Joe seen you? Are you crazy?" "Am I crazy?" Lorraine hissed back, shaking Polly off her arm. "You're acting like we're long-lost friends." Polly backed up and bumped into Helen Wiggins, nearly knocking both of them down. Recovering herself, Polly announced, "Look, Helen, it's Lorraine. She's having a little visit to Dysonville to, catch up?" Polly concluded with a smile. Helen lunged forward. Polly grabbed her arm and opposite shoulder, turned her around, and shooting Lorraine a threatening look, said, "Okay then, Helen, let's go. Bye, Lorraine. Don't overstay your welcome. That's so tacky." Lorraine wasn't native to Dysonville, but she was native to Tennessee, having grown up only a couple of hours' drive away. She first came to town at the age of 24 to attend the Dysonville Community College and to distance herself from a twice-dead relationship. She dropped out after one semester, secure in her conclusion that searching for a more suitable mate had the potential to be much less difficult and much more satisfying than attending class and studying. Lorraine had long recognized her own beauty and the power it could wield, and she could feign friendly when it suited her purposes. In the summer of 1981, it suited her purposes to be friendly to Joe Morgan. Morgan's bar sat on the south edge of town on a hill of oak and hickory. The building itself was small or cozy, depending on who you ask, wooden and painted brick red. The inside was dimly lit, with tables, booths, and a long, beautiful bar Ed Morgan had found at a flea market the year he opened. Morgan's was the place to be in Dysonville if you wanted to know the latest gossip, if you wanted to see friends, or if you just wanted to sit alone with your beer. Everyone knew Morgan's. Lorraine walked in one humid August afternoon dressed in a halter-top shorts and sandals, fanning herself in the late summer heat. She took a seat at the end of the bar. Joe had no idea how long he had been staring when his dad touched his shoulder, causing him to jump and exclaim with a loud "Ah!" I'm sorry, my dog was barking. If I get him to stop, I'll continue. Customers from several tables turned toward the bar in concern. Joe noticed that the woman looked amused. He raised an index finger and said, "Burn, sorry, bad burn, got it in the hot water." He felt his face heat and color, and suddenly he found himself both at a loss for words and at a loss in general as to what to do next. "Want to see what she wants to drink?" Ed suggested, grinning at his red-faced son. Yeah, Joe let out a breath. "Yeah, sure," Joe replied again, feigning confidence and avoiding his father's eye. "After all, that's my job." "Yes, that is your job," his dad replied, patting Joe on the shoulder. Within a week, Lorraine and Joe were dating, and by the time Ed handed Joe the keys to the business 1 year later, they were married. Another year, and Lillian was born, and a month after that, Lorraine vanished without her child. Only days later, Doris left town as well. That no one understood. Doris Martin had been a part of Helen and Alice Wiggins' life and the life of the town for over 20 years. Chapter 2. Sunday lunch out was a given for Polly and Helen, but on this particular Sunday, they headed straight to Polly's for leftovers and privacy. Polly lived in a large brick house, fronted by an open porch surrounded by a low brick wall. When you entered the front door, you were in a large and rarely used living room, overfilled with treasures. Beyond this room was a dining room, kitchen, and a sun-drenched parlor where Polly and Helen sat on many an afternoon. "That woman," Helen began as soon as she was behind Polly's door. "What on earth is she doing here? Why didn't you just let me hit her?" she thought, just once, just for Doris. But she said, for Joe and Lillian. And how does she think Joe is going to react when he finds out she's here? Helen was pacing back and forth, so preoccupied that she didn't notice Polly leave for the kitchen. Had she been less so, she might have been alarmed at the pallor of Polly's skin. "Oh my God, Lillian," Helen continued loudly enough for Polly to hear her in the next room. "You don't think she's here for Lillian? Oh my God, the party, Polly!" Polly jumped, almost spilling the soup she was bringing into the room. "We have to get her right out of town," Helen continued, looking at Polly with tears of anger in her eyes. "That's all there is to it. She just has to go." "You think?" Polly responded, putting the soup on the coffee table. "I'm having a drink, Helen. Just shut up and tell me if you want to join me." "We need to call Joe, Polly, right now," Helen responded, ignoring the offer. "Helen," Polly said, holding her by both arms and encouraging her to sit, "relax. Have some lunch. Your party will be wonderful as usual, and no one would allow Lillian to be hurt. Do you think Joe would let that woman anywhere near her?" "Working in our favor. Lorraine has the maternal instincts of a reptile. Whatever she's up to, she'll keep her distance from Lil." Helen's panic had temporarily drawn Polly's attention away from her own fears. Now, she suddenly realized how urgently she needed to see Lorraine. Okay, Helen," she said. "Here's what we're going to do. You call Joe. You let him know the Dragon Lady is back in town. Let Joe decide what to say to Lil. I'll find Lorraine. See if I can figure out what she's up to." Once out of Helen's sight, Polly downed a sloppily made martini and ran for the car, her mind racing. "See if I can figure out what Lorraine is up to? My ass, I absolutely have to know what she's up to, and sooner rather than later." At 75, Polly was bright and alert, physically fit enough to live alone and continue to drive. She saw to it that her hair remained inky black. Her face was quite pretty, boasting dark eyebrows and dark piercing eyes which for the first time in a very long time betrayed fear. She was sure Lorraine wasn't here for Joe or Lillian. Why on earth would she want them back in her life now? Lorraine was here for her, and no good could come of that. Polly felt her heart beating much too fast. After several phone calls, Polly found Lorraine at the Anchor House, an old and majestic downtown hotel that was nonetheless not too expensive due to age and some lack of upkeep. Polly knocked, and the door was answered by an alarmingly welcoming Lorraine, now dressed in jeans and a carefully ironed linen sleeveless blouse. Polly had never stopped to change out of her church clothes. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me," Lorraine began, clearly expecting the visit. "And many thanks for protecting my nose from Helen's fist," Lorraine smiled, turning her back on the open door. Polly followed her into the room, somewhat hesitantly closing the door behind her. "You care for some tea?" Lorraine continued. "I've just finished lunch." "No thanks, I wouldn't trust it. And you should know that Helen has warned me about stopping her again should her fist be on the way to your face." Polly was trying hard to sound more angry than afraid. Lorraine smiled and poured a cup for herself. Polly helped herself to a chair. "Okay," Polly began, "you're going to tell me right now why you're here, and most importantly, when you're leaving. What can you be thinking?" "I think of this as my home, Polly," Lorraine answered. "Your home? Lorraine, you left this home, your husband, and your daughter 15 years ago," Polly replied. "This is my home," Lorraine began again, "and I'm here to stay, at least for a bit." "To stay? To stay?" Polly was on her feet. "Lorraine, among other things, you abandoned your month-old child. Left without a word to anyone. Just a note for Joe. A note!" In the intervening years, Lillian has become one of Dysonville's favorite daughters. Well loved. No one will put up with your presence here. If only to protect her, how can you stay? What possible kind of life can you have here? Lorraine turned a menacing eye in Polly's direction. Polly, do you remember how close we were all those many years back? I've actually missed you. Have you missed me? Polly realized that once again she was sitting. Perhaps she'd simply fallen back into the chair. She became suddenly aware that the otherwise cheerfully furnished and sun-warmed room had given way to Lorraine's icy stare. Oh, come on, Polly, Lorraine continued. We had fun, didn't we? Polly processed the absurd question as if through the lens of a dream. Looking around and recovering herself as best she could, she replied, Fun? Fun. Tearing Helen and Doris apart. Are you kidding? And Lorraine, if you breathe one word about my part in that, I will destroy you, and you know I can. Lorraine stood very still and looked directly at Polly. After what you bade me to do, really? Polly felt sick. She knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. Lorraine turned and looked out her window. It was high enough that she could see all of beautiful downtown Dysonville, which wasn't. Did you know, Lorraine continued, when I realized that Joe didn't have the balls to try to find me, I thought about taking you down anyway. I thought about the great satisfaction I would derive from simply waltzing back into town on your money and telling everyone what a racist bitch you really are. Lorraine lit a cigarette and sipped her tea, but then I realized that if I did that, the people who stood to be hurt the most were Helen and Gordon. I have no reason to hurt them. Lorraine looked at Polly and sighed. Poor Helen, left to assume that she must have played some role and left alone, thanks to the meddling jealousy of someone claiming to be her best friend. We protected Helen, Polly responded doggedly, by getting Doris out of her life. Whatever, Polly, now you listen to me. Who of the two of us, to your way of thinking, has the most to lose should the past refuse to stay buried? Memories flooded Polly's mind, along with an accompanying pain, somewhat resembling that of a broken heart. But soon the flood abated. Polly had rewritten these memories until the originals had crumbled and drifted away like old paper too often folded. All that was left now, all that Polly could allow to be left, was the clear and certain belief that everything had always been about protecting Helen. The problem was that Helen would never see it that way. Polly felt weak. Of course she had the most to lose. Polly had a very great deal to lose. Polly held all the cards. Lorraine held all the cards, every one of them. So Polly heard from someplace very far away. I'll be needing some additional funding, don't you think? I certainly can't live at this hotel. Perhaps you know of someplace that would be more appropriate. There are some nice townhouses. Look new, just on the edge of town. You should inquire about a unit for me. By this time, Polly was on her feet once more, but she was not steady. Lorraine, you're blackmailing me? Oh, let's not call it blackmail, Lorraine replied. That's so tacky. Let's just call it helping a friend, one you owe and owe big. As I recall, Polly responded, feeling the somewhat steadying influence of anger, you helped me get rid of Doris, and I helped you get out of town with a good deal of money. How is it that I owe you? Look at it this way, Lorraine sat, still holding her tea. You're still without Doris, which is good, at least from where you stand. But I've long been out of that money. That's not so good from where I stand. Lorraine smiled, and Polly felt herself grow paler still. That's the end of chapter 2, and that's almost the end of my recording time. So I will pick it up with chapter 3. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye.